I'm Arthur. For nearly a quarter of a century, there was only one face a Romanian could be sure of seeing on a television set. It was on the morning news and the evening news, on the cultural programs and the farm reports, in the long, slow broadcasts of crowds applauding in perfect time. The state owned every channel, and for the last years of his rule, the state had cut the channels down to almost nothing, a couple of hours a night, most of it devoted to him. So here is the thing I cannot get past, the small bitter symmetry at the heart of this story. The man who turned a nation's television into a single endless portrait of himself was, in the end, undone by it. The country watched him lose his grip on live television, and then, on Christmas Day, it watched him die on it too. Tonight I want to tell you the whole of that story, slowly, from the very beginning. How a barefoot shoemaker's apprentice from a dirt-poor village climbed to the top of a country and crowned himself a kind of god. What he did to his people across 24 years to earn the wall they finally stood him against, and how a revolution that began with one stubborn pastor ended, 8 days later, with 2 bodies in a frozen courtyard and a camera that arrived a few seconds too late. Get comfortable. This is a long road, and we are going to walk every mile of it. 1989, Christmas Day. There is dirty snow on the ground. In a bare classroom inside the barracks, a hasty trial has just ended after less than an hour, and an old man and an old woman in heavy winter coats have been told they are going to be shot. Their hands are being tied behind their backs with rope. They are led out into a small courtyard against a wall pocked with the cold, and a line of young paratroopers raises rifles. The old man begins, of all things, to sing a few bars of a revolutionary anthem he had sung his entire life. Then the rifles open up, and they do not stop quickly. The 2 people against that wall were Nicolae Ceausescu, the supreme leader of Romania, and his wife Elena, who for years had been the second most powerful person in the country. A day and a half earlier they had still been, on paper, the absolute rulers of a nation of more than 23 million people. Now they were corpses in the snow, and within hours the whole country would see them that way, laid out on the floor, on the same television service that had spent decades insisting they were the most beloved couple on earth. I want you to hold the strangeness of that, because it is the spine of everything that follows. Dictators usually fall in the dark. They disappear into a cellar, or a plane, or an unmarked grave, and the official story is managed afterward. Ceausescu fell in full view. The moment his power broke, it broke on live television, in front of his own people, in a single unbearable instant that millions of them watched at the same time. And the moment he died, the new authorities did not hide it. They filmed the trial, they filmed the bodies, they put it all on the air. For a man who had controlled every image of himself with absolute care for 24 years, it was the final and most complete humiliation. The screen he had owned showed the country his face one last time, and his eyes were open, and he was dead. How does a nation arrive at that? Not a sudden coup in a far-off capital, but a whole people pushed past the edge of fear, deciding in the space of a single week that the only acceptable ending was a wall and a firing squad on Christmas morning. To understand it, you have to understand the hunger and the cold and the silence that came before it, the 24 years of slow suffocation that made a gentle people capable of that, because that is the real mystery at the center of this, and I do not want us to lose sight of it. Romanians are not, by reputation or by history, a violent or a bloodthirsty people. They had endured, for a generation, with extraordinary patience, and yet at the very end they wanted this, the wall, the rifles, the bodies on the screen, and a great many of them felt, in that moment, not horror, but a kind of release. To understand how patience curdles into that, you have to live through the 24 years alongside them, at least in the telling. So that is what we are going to do. And to understand the man they killed, you have to go back, a long way back, before the palaces and the titles and the endless applause, to a poor village in the south of Romania and a boy who left it with nothing but his shoes. Nicolae Ceausescu was born on the 26th of January 1918 in a village called Scornăcești in the dry farming country of southern Romania. He was one of a great many children, the third of 9 or 10 depending on who is counting, crowded into a small house with a dirt floor and not nearly enough of anything. His father drank and farmed a few poor acres and had, by most accounts, a heavy hand. There was nothing in that childhood to mark the boy out. He was small, he stammered slightly, he did poorly at the village school, and like millions of peasant children across Europe in those years, his future seemed to consist of the same dirt and the same poverty his parents had known. At around the age of 11, he was sent off to Bucharest, the capital, to be apprenticed to a shoemaker. This was an ordinary fate for a poor boy, a trade that might one day keep him fed. But the workshop he landed in happened to be a meeting place for members of the Communist Party, which in Romania at that time was illegal, tiny, and hunted. The country between the wars was a monarchy, deeply unequal, ruled by landowners and a king, and the handful of communists who organized in its cities and factories were treated as criminals and locked up when they were caught. The young apprentice took to their ideas with the fervor of a boy who had nothing and had just been told, for the first time, that his nothing was someone else's fault. He was arrested for the first time as a teenager for agitation, for handing out leaflets, for the kind of low-level troublemaking the authorities watched closely. Over the 1930s and into the war years he was in and out of prisons and detention camps, and it was inside those walls that the most important thing in his early life happened. He met the men who would run Romania after the war. Prison was the university of the Romanian communists. Locked up together, they argued and organized and sorted themselves into a hierarchy, and a young, fierce, not very educated man named Nicolae attached himself to a rising figure named Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej, who would become the country's communist leader. Ceausescu became his protege, his loyal man, the one who did the unglamorous work and remembered who had been faithful. Somewhere in those years he also met Elena Petrisi, a young woman from a village much like his own, with even less schooling than he had. She had worked in a laboratory as an assistant, sweeping floors and washing glassware, a fact that matters enormously later, because she would one day rebuild that humble job into a fantasy of herself as a world-famous scientist. They married soon after the war. It was, by all accounts, a genuine partnership and a genuine devotion, the two of them against the world, and it would stay that way to the very end, all the way to the wall at Targovist. Whatever else you say about them, they went down together, holding to each other, and that was true of them their whole lives. The war changed everything. In 1944, with the Soviet army driving westward and Romania switching sides, the door swung open for the communists. Backed by Moscow and by the presence of Soviet troops, the tiny, illegal party of a few thousand became, within a few years, the only party that mattered. The king was forced out. Elections were rigged. Rivals were arrested, exiled, or worse. By the end of the 1940s, Romania was a one-party communist state firmly inside the Soviet orbit, and Gheorghiu Dej was its master. The making of that state was a brutal business, and it is worth pausing on, because it was the school in which Ceausescu was raised. The king was forced to abdicate at the very end of 1947, pressured, by the usual account, with threats of bloodshed if he refused, and sent into exile. Across the country, people judged to be enemies of the new order, landowners and priests, former officers, intellectuals, and ordinary peasants who would not surrender their farms, were swept into a vast network of prisons and labor camps. Many thousands were set to digging a great canal toward the Black Sea in conditions so lethal that it became known as a place men were sent to die. This was the machine that Ceausescu served and climbed, learning its gears from the inside, year by year. Whatever gentleness he would later perform in his first seasons as leader, he had come up through the hardest school the century had on offer, and he had been a diligent student. And rising steadily behind him, gathering jobs and titles and quiet influence, running the party's personnel and then its army, was his faithful protégé from the prison years. For most of the 1950s, Ceausescu was a backroom man, an organizer, the sort of figure who is never the public face but always knows where the levers are. He was not brilliant, he was not charming, he was not a great speaker then or ever. What he was patient, suspicious, tireless, and very good at the one skill that decides who survives inside a dictatorship, which is knowing who your enemies are before they know they are your enemies. And so when Gheorghe Dej died of cancer in March of 1965, and the leadership of the Romanian Communist Party fell open, the man who took it was not the obvious heir, not the polished intellectual or the famous minister, but the quiet one. Nicolae Ceausescu, the shoemaker's son from Scornăcești, became, at the age of 47, the leader of Romania. He moved with the patience he had spent 3 decades learning. Step by step, he eased out the old guard who had expected to manage him, promoted his own loyal men into the key positions, and drew the ANAP, livers of the party and the security organs, steadily into his own hands. Within a few years, the very men who had chosen him as a safe, controllable figure found themselves retired, sidelined, or simply gone, and the colorless functionary they had installed had become the unchallenged master of the country. It is the oldest story in the long history of dictatorships, and the men around him walked straight into it because they had mistaken patience for weakness and silence for stupidity. Almost no one outside the party knew much about him. Inside it, the men who had backed him assumed they had chosen a manageable figure, a colorless functionary they could control, a safe pair of hands. It was the single greatest miscalculation any of them would ever make. The quiet one had been watching them for 30 years. Here is the part of the story that surprises people, the part that almost no one remembers now. For the first several years, Nicolae Ceausescu looked like one of the best things that had ever happened to Romania. And not only to Romania, to the West, to Washington and London and Paris, he looked like a miracle. When he took over in 1965, he moved carefully and cleverly. He eased some of the harshest controls of the previous era. He let a little more freedom into the arts and the press. He released political prisoners. He talked about socialist legality, about the rule of law, about correcting past abuses, and for a while he seemed to mean it. People who lived through those first years often remember them, even decades later, as a kind of brief spring. The shops had goods in them. The mood lifted. A young, energetic leader was promising that the worst was behind them. For a few years, he even let Romanians breathe a little. Western films and books trickled in. Writers tested the edges of what could be said. People traveled, met foreigners, allowed themselves to imagine that their country might be inching toward something more open and more humane. That brief thaw is important to hold on to, because it is what makes everything that came later so much darker. The Romanians of the 1980s were not a people who had never known anything else. They had been shown a glimpse of a gentler life, and then had it deliberately, methodically taken back. But it was his foreign policy that made the world fall in love with him. Romania was a member of the Warsaw Pact, the military alliance Moscow ran over its satellite states, and the iron rule of that alliance was that you followed the Soviet line. Ceausescu, almost from the start, refused to. He cultivated his own relationships, kept ties with the West, recognized West Germany, kept talking to Israel when the rest of the bloc cut it off. He behaved, in other words, like the leader of an independent country, which in the Soviet bloc was close to heresy. And then came the moment that made him a hero. In August of 1968, the Soviet Union and its allies invaded Czechoslovakia to crush a reform movement, the Prague Spring, that had dared to imagine a gentler kind of communism. Tanks rolled into Prague. The whole Warsaw Pact took part, all of them except one. Ceausescu not only refused to send Romanian troops, he climbed onto a balcony in Bucharest in front of an enormous crowd and publicly, furiously condemned the invasion as a crime against a brother nation. The crowd roared. It was, by every account, the most genuinely popular moment of his entire life, a moment when a real and spontaneous wave of love rose up to meet him. Romanians believed that day that they had a leader brave enough to stand up to the giant next door. Hold on to that image of a man on a balcony in Bucharest in front of a vast, adoring, roaring crowd, because 21 years later he would stand on another balcony in front of another vast crowd, and it would go very differently. The same stage would be the scene of his greatest triumph and his final ruin. He just could not know that yet. In 1968, the balcony loved him. The West was watching, and the West was delighted. Here, it seemed, was a communist leader who would defy Moscow, a crack in the monolith that could be pried open. The courtship began. In 1969, the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, came to Bucharest, the first visit by an American president to a communist country in the Soviet bloc. Ceausescu was feted in Western capitals. He was given loans, trade deals, state visits, honors. Britain would later give him a state visit hosted by the Queen and an honorary knighthood. He was, for a decade, the acceptable communist, the maverick, the man you could do business with, and he drank in the flattery of the world's most powerful leaders like a man who had been thirsty his whole life. The courtship reached heights that look extraordinary in hindsight. In 1969, the American president came to Bucharest and stood beside him before cheering crowds. Through the 1970s, the doors of the West swung wide. Romania was given favorable trade status, welcomed into Western financial institutions, and showered with the very loans that would one day become the noose. In 1978, he was received in Britain on a full state visit, a guest of the Queen herself, lodged in the palace, and handed an honorary knighthood. Royalty and presidents lined up to flatter the shoemaker's son from Scornacesti, and he loved every minute of it. There is a story, often told in Britain, that the Queen, out walking her dogs in the palace garden during that visit, saw the Romanian party approaching and stepped behind a bush to avoid them. True or not, the tale catches something about how the man was beginning to be regarded even as he was being feted, a figure it was useful to court and faintly unpleasant to be near, and the flattery was working a terrible change in him. In 1974, he had the Rebetavlomantament, obedient National Assembly, invent a brand new office for him to occupy, President of the Republic, a post no communist before him had ever held, and at the ceremony marking it he was handed a scepter, a literal jeweled staff of the sort a king carries. A communist leader, supposedly the servant of the workers, gripping a royal scepter in his fist. The absurdity was so glaring that the great surrealist painter Salvador Dali sent him a telegram of mock congratulation, praising him with thick irony for his fine new presidential scepter. And the regime, so utterly deaf to ridicule that it could not even recognize it, proudly printed Dali's sarcastic little telegram in the official party newspaper, as though it were a sincere salute from a famous admirer. He had been publicly mocked by one of the great tricksters of the age, and he had thanked him for it, in print, for the whole country to applaud. And that, it turned out, was the problem. Because all of this attention, all of this red carpet treatment from kings and presidents was pouring into a man who had grown up with nothing, who had stammered through a village school, who had spent 30 years as the overlooked one in the back of the room. The praise did not steady him. It went to his head like wine. He began to believe the things that were being said about him. He began to believe he was, in fact, a great man, a world historical figure, a genius. And around 1971, he took a trip that would turn that growing self-regard into something far more dangerous. In the middle of 1971, Ceausescu and Elena set off on a long state tour of Asia. They visited China, where Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution was still convulsing the country. They visited North Korea, the sealed kingdom of Kim Il-sung. They went on to Vietnam and Mongolia. And what Nicolae Ceausescu saw on that journey changed the course of Romanian history, and not for the better. In North Korea especially, he saw something that seems to have struck him like a revelation. He saw a leader worshipped, not merely obeyed, not merely feared, but adored as a living deity, his portrait everywhere, his name attached to everything, his every word treated as holy. He saw mass spectacle on a scale he had never imagined, tens of thousands of people moving in flawless unison in vast stadiums, holding up colored cards to make enormous images of the leader's face, a whole society arranged into a single shining mirror that reflected one man back at himself. He saw what total control could look like when it was dressed up as total love, and it is worth sitting with how strange his reaction was. Most outsiders who visit such a place come home unsettled, even frightened, by the sheer engineered unreality of it, the dead-eyed perfection of the spectacle. Ceausescu came home inspired. He did not see a warning, he saw a blueprint. Here at last was a model of what a leader could be, not the mere manager of a state, but its very object of worship, the single fixed sun around which an entire society was made to turn. He wanted it. And he had the absolute power, and the absolutely devoted wife, and the obedient machinery, to spend the next 18 years building it at home, stone by stone and law by law, around the necks of his own people. Elena, by every account, was just as taken with it as he was, perhaps more. And the two of them came home from Asia transformed. The careful reformer of the 1960s, the man who had loosened the controls and talked about legality, was gone. In his place was a man who had glimpsed a vision of himself as a god and meant to build it. The turn was almost immediate. In July of 1971, only weeks after returning, Ceausescu issued a set of directives that came to be known as the July Theses. On paper, they were dry proposals about ideology and culture. In practice, they were a declaration of war on the small freedoms of the previous years. The brief opening of the press and the arts was reversed. Culture was to serve the party again. Ideology was to be hammered back into every corner of life. It was, in miniature, a Romanian echo of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, a deliberate hardening, a slamming shut of the window that had briefly been open. The spring was over, and from that point on, year by year, the country began its long descent into one of the strangest and most suffocating personality cults the modern world had ever produced. What makes it stranger still is the timing. Through the 1970s, while Ceausescu was turning Romania inward and tightening his grip at home, the West still saw the maverick of 1968. The loans kept coming. The state visits kept happening. The leaders of the free world kept shaking his hand and toasting his independence, while inside his own country the machinery of worship was being bolted into place and the machinery of fear was being oiled and readied. The outside world saw the brave man on the balcony. It did not yet see what he was becoming behind the curtain. By the time it did, the damage was deep, and the loans had become a noose that Ceausescu would, in the end, tighten around his own people's necks. To understand what Romania became in the 1970s and 80s, you have to understand the cult. Not as a joke, though parts of it were absurd, but as a system, a thing that touched every life in the country every single day. Ceausescu gave himself titles, and the titles grew more grandiose with each passing year. He was the Dictator, the leader, a word with heavy echoes of an earlier era of strongmen. He was hailed as the genius of the Carpathians. He was compared, in the official press, to the great heroes of Romanian history, to ancient kings and warrior princes, presented as the natural culmination of the whole national story, the man toward whom all of Romanian history had been quietly building for 2,000 years. His birthday became a national event. Poets wrote odes to him, choirs sang to him, children were organized into vast displays of devotion. Every book, it sometimes seemed, every speech, every newspaper had to begin by invoking him. His era was even given an official name, stamped on everything, repeated without the faintest embarrassment. It was the Golden Age, the epoch of light. His birthday each January was turned into something close to a religious festival, with televised galas and children in folk dress and pyramids of gifts and recited verse. Court poets compared him openly to the sun, to the great oak, to the Carpathian peaks themselves. The country's history books were quietly rewritten to set him at the very summit of the national story, the destined fulfillment of every Romanian prince and hero who had ever lived. 2,000 years of history bending, it was suggested, toward the arrival of this one man. And his image was governed by rules of almost religious strictness. There were correct ways to photograph him and forbidden ways. Retouchers made him look younger and taller. He was almost never to be shown alone with a flaw, a stumble, a moment of ordinary human weakness. The whole vast machinery existed to project a single, flawless, permanent figure. There is a peculiar cruelty in a freezing, hungry country being informed, every single day, in poems and on the evening news, that it is living through a golden age of light and being made to applaud the announcement. And television, the television that opens this story, became the central instrument of the whole performance. By the late 1980s, as austerity bit and the country was plunged into darkness to save power, Romanian state television had been cut back to roughly 2 hours a day. 2 hours. And the overwhelming bulk of those 2 precious hours was given over to the leader. The news was him, visiting a factory, touring a field, receiving applause, delivering a speech. The cameras were trained to show him a certain way, always central, always greeted with rapturous, rhythmic clapping that could go on for many minutes. There were strict rules about how he could be filmed. He was never to be shown in a bad light, never from an unflattering angle, never less than perfect. A whole nation sat in its cold living rooms each night and watched, for 2 hours, an unbroken hymn to a single man. But here is what most accounts of the cult leave out, and what I think is the key to the whole tragedy. There were 2 of them, because alongside Nicolae, rising with him, sharing his power in a way no dictator's wife had quite done before, was Elena. This is the woman who had once washed glassware in a laboratory, who had little formal education, who could, by some accounts, barely write a coherent letter, and the cult rebuilt her, brick by absurd brick, into one of the great scientific minds of the age. She was styled, in the official language, Comrade Academician Dr. Engineer Elena Ceausescu, a string of honors meant to crown her as a world-renowned scientist, a chemist of international standing. She was given a doctorate. Her name went on scientific papers and books that were, in fact, written by real scientists who were ordered to hand over their work and stay silent about it. She accepted honorary degrees from institutions around the world, granted by people eager to flatter her husband. And inside Romania, anyone who knew the truth, which was a great many people, had to keep an absolutely straight face and praise the brilliance of a woman whose only genuine expertise was in the accumulation of power, and accumulate it she did. Elena became, over the 1970s and 80s, the second most powerful person in Romania. She controlled appointments. She sat at the center of the regime's decision-making. She was widely understood to be even harder, even colder, even more vindictive than her husband, and there were many who believed it was Elena who pushed Nicolae toward the cruelest of his policies and held him to them. She is remembered for a particular pettiness of power, a hunger to be the most decorated, the most lettered, the most celebrated woman in the land, and a sharp vindictiveness toward anyone who threatened that standing. The real chemists of Romania had to sit in silence while a woman who could barely follow their work was proclaimed their queen, attend ceremonies staged in her honor, and watch her name printed atop research they themselves had done. Education and science fell heavily under her shadow. To rise in those fields, it helped enormously to flatter her. To cross her was to end a career, or worse. In a regime built on fear, she became one of its sharpest single sources. The 2 of them ran the country as a family business, promoting relatives into key posts, treating the wealth and the apparatus of a nation of 23 million people as their personal property. The Romanians had a bitter joke about it, as people under dictatorships always do, a way of naming the thing that could not be named aloud. They were ruled, the joke went, not by a government but by a household. And in that household, the wife was no junior partner. So when the end came, it came for both of them. It is one of the reasons the title of this story is what it is. Romania did not only kill its dictator, it killed his wife beside him, against the same wall, in the same minute, because in the minds of the people who had suffered under them, the 2 were a single thing, a single weight that had sat on the country's chest for a generation. You could not lift one without lifting the other. We are about halfway now, and this is a natural place to stop for a moment. If these long, quiet histories are something you are glad to have playing in the dark of an evening, you can follow along here, and there will always be another one waiting. Then we will go straight on, and I will not break the thread again. So, back to what that household was doing to the country it had made its own. If you want to feel how far into people's lives this regime reached, you do not start with the speeches or the palaces. You start with the most private corner of human existence, the decision of whether and when to have a child, because that decision, in Ceausescu's Romania, was taken away from the people who should have made it and handed to the state. The story begins early, in 1966, The year after Ceausescu took power, with a piece of legislation usually remembered simply as the decree, Romania's birth rate had been falling. Ceausescu, who dreamed of a larger, stronger, more powerful nation, decided that the country would have more Romanians whether its women wanted to bear them or not. And so the decree abruptly banned almost all abortion and outlawed contraception, which were essentially the only forms of family planning then available. There were narrow exceptions for women already past a certain age, or who already had a set number of children, or in cases of grave medical danger. For everyone else, the door was simply slammed. The effect was immediate and staggering. In the single year after the decree, the number of babies born in Romania very nearly doubled. A whole sudden generation summoned into being by command, children who would grow up known, with dark affection, as the children of the decree. Some of them, grown into students, would be among the young people in the streets at the very end. The leader had ordered a nation to be born. He did not stop to ask what kind of life was waiting for it. To enforce it, the state turned medicine into surveillance. Women of childbearing age were subjected to regular gynecological examinations at their workplaces, monitored to detect pregnancies early so that those pregnancies could be tracked to term. The secret police took an interest in hospitals, watching to make sure no doctor quietly helped a desperate woman. A pregnancy became, in a real sense, the business of the government, and the human cost of this was enormous and grim, in ways I will not dwell on out of respect, except to say the obvious. When you forbid people something they are determined to do, you do not stop them. You only drive it into the shadows, where it becomes far more dangerous. The toll on Romanian women across those years was severe, and it is one of the darkest threads in the whole fabric of this regime. And there was another consequence, one that the world would only see clearly after the regime had fallen. Across the country, in cities and towns, the state filled up with children that families crushed by poverty and the same austerity we will come to simply could not feed or keep. Tens of thousands of them ended up in state institutions, in overcrowded orphanages, raised without enough food, without enough warmth, without enough of the simple human care that a child needs. When foreign journalists finally walked into those institutions after 1989, what they found shocked the world. It stands as one of the regime's most haunting legacies, an entire generation of children, warehoused as the byproduct of one man's obsession with numbers. I will leave it there, soberly, because these were real children and they deserve more than to be a horror in someone else's documentary. But you should know it happened, and you should know why. It happened because the state had decided it owned the future, down to the cradle. This is the part of the cult that the choirs and the odes were built to hide. Underneath the worship, the regime ran on a second engine, and that engine was fear, administered by an institution whose name still makes older Romanians lower their voices: the Securitate, the secret police. By the end, the Securitate employed something like 15,000 full-time officers. That number alone is not extraordinary. What was extraordinary was the network beneath it, the informers, ordinary citizens recruited, pressured, or blackmailed into reporting on their neighbors, their colleagues, their friends, their own families. Estimates of how many informers the Securitate ran vary widely, but the most cited figures reach as high as 500,000 people in a country of 23 million. Whatever the exact number, the effect was total. Romanians lived with the working assumption that anything they said could be reported, that the man at the next desk might be writing them up, that the telephone listened, that a careless joke about the leader could cost them their job, their apartment, their child's place at university, or their freedom. The reach of it could be almost comic, were it not so suffocating. The state grew so frightened of the printed word that it required people to register their typewriters with the police, surrendering a sample of each machine's typeface so that any anonymous leaflet could be matched to the desk it had been typed on. Owning a typewriter became a licensed activity, like owning a weapon. Citizens were required to report their contacts with foreigners, to declare conversations with any outsider, so that a chance exchange with a tourist could turn into a file with your name on it. To let a foreigner stay the night under your roof, even a cousin from abroad, could bring the authorities to your door. People learned to speak in code, to trust almost no one, to keep the dangerous thoughts behind their teeth. A whole nation was taught, slowly and thoroughly, to be afraid of itself. And the cruelest part is how ordinary it became. Children learned, without ever being told in so many words, that there were things you did not say in front of certain relatives. Friends learned which subjects to step around. A whole language of silence and sidelong glances grew up to fill the space where honest speech used to be. It is a hard thing to convey to anyone who has not lived it, that low, constant hum of self-censorship. The way it gets into a person and stays, that is the quiet horror that does not make it onto the screen. Not a massacre, not a famous atrocity, but the daily, grinding, decades-long work of making millions of people watch their own tongues. It is the kind of damage that does not photograph, and it is the kind that takes generations to heal. Now we come to the thing that, more than the cult, more than the secret police, more than anything else, finally broke the country's patience. We come to the hunger and the cold, and the maddening, almost unbelievable reason for it. Through the 1970s, Ceausescu had borrowed heavily from Western banks and governments, the same governments that were busy flattering him. He borrowed to build factories, to industrialize, to fund his growing ambitions. Romania's foreign debt climbed from a little over $1 billion at the start of the decade to around $13 billion by the early 1980s. And then the global economy turned. Interest rates rose. The price of the things Romania sold abroad fell. The debt, which had seemed manageable, suddenly loomed like a mountain, and Romania began to struggle to make its payments. A different leader might have renegotiated, or defaulted, or simply muddled through the way many indebted nations did. Ceausescu did something else. Sometime around 1981, he made a decision that revealed everything about him, about his pride, his obsession with independence, his complete indifference to the suffering of ordinary people. He decided that Romania would repay every last dollar of its foreign debt, all of it, as fast as humanly possible, so that no foreign banker would ever again have any hold over him. It would be a triumph of national sovereignty, and the entire cost of that triumph would be paid by the Romanian people out of their stomachs and their bodies. To earn the foreign currency to pay the banks, Ceausescu exported the things Romanian produced. The problem was that the most valuable things Romanian produced were food and fuel, the very things its own people needed to live. So the food was loaded onto ships and trains and sent abroad, and the people went without. Meat vanished from the shops. So did sugar, flour, cooking oil, butter, eggs. What remained was rationed, parceled out in meager amounts, and even the rations were often not there when you reached the front of the line. And the lines became the defining image of Romanian life in the 1980s. People queued for hours before dawn in the cold, not knowing if anything would be left when they got to the counter. Mothers sent their children to stand in one line while they stood in another. An entire nation spent a huge portion of its waking life simply waiting for the chance to buy a little food. The regime would not call it hunger, of course. It dressed the shortage up in the language of science. There was an official program pushed in the newspapers that promoted what it called a rational diet, a tidy little set of reduced portions the state declared to be the correct and healthy amount for a citizen to consume. The near famine was rebranded as a wellness plan. People were informed that going without was good for them, and the indignities multiplied past the point of parity. The gas pressure in the pipes was kept so low that it could take the better part of an hour to boil a single pot of water. Refrigerators stood empty and switched off because there was nothing to keep cold and no power to spare for keeping it. Elevators in the apartment towers were shut down to save electricity, so the old and the sick climbed 10 flights in the dark. A modern European people spent the 1980s measuring out their lives in ration coupons and candle stubs, in a country their leader insisted was the envy of the world. The energy was exported too, and so the country was plunged into darkness and cold to save every possible kilowatt for sale abroad. Street lights were switched off. Television, as we have seen, was cut to 2 hours a night. Home heating was throttled down to almost nothing, so that people sat in their apartments in winter in their coats and hats, their breath visible indoors, children doing homework by candlelight. Hospitals went short of heat and supplies. The shop windows of Bucharest, a city that had once been called the Paris of the East, went dark and empty. By the official measures of the time, the standard of living of the Romanian people fell by something between a fifth and nearly half across those years. A modern, industrialized, European country, in peacetime, deliberately starved and frozen by its own government, not because of war, not because of famine, not because of any disaster, but to pay off a debt that meant nothing to the people paying for it. Think about what that did to ordinary days. A family rising before dawn so that someone could go and stand in a line on the rumor of a delivery of eggs. Children doing their schoolwork in coats and gloves, their breath showing in the lamplight. Old people who simply did not survive the cold of their own apartments through the worst of the winters. Doctors operating in hospitals where the heat had been cut and the supplies had run out. The whole rhythm of life reorganized around scarcity and waiting, around the daily hunt for the most basic things, in a country that sat on good farmland and had, a single generation earlier, fed itself well. This was not the aftermath of a war or a plague. It was a policy, chosen at the top, held in place for the better part of a decade, in the service of a number on a foreign ledger. And here is the cruelest turn of all. In the spring of 1989, Ceausescu got his triumph. The debt was paid. Romania owed the foreign banks nothing. He announced it with enormous pride, presented it as one of the great achievements of his rule, proof of his genius and the nation's strength. And the suffering did not end. The shops stayed empty, the lights stayed off, the lines stayed long, because by then the austerity was not really about the debt anymore. It was simply how the country was run. The people had bled for years to reach a finish line, and when they crossed it, nothing changed. I think that, more than any single event, is the moment the regime was finished, even if it took a few more months for anyone to say so out loud. You can ask people to suffer for a reason. What you cannot do is make them suffer, win the thing they suffered for, and then keep suffering anyway. That is not a policy. That is a kind of madness. And by 1989, a great many Romanians had quietly concluded that the man at the top had lost his mind. While the people froze in the dark and queued for bread, Ceausescu was building. And what he built, in the heart of his hungry capital, is so enormous that it is still there today, impossible to ignore. The largest single monument to one man's vanity in modern Europe. The obsession with remaking the country had been growing for years. In the countryside, Ceausescu launched a program with the bland bureaucratic name of systematization. In plain terms, it was a plan to bulldoze the traditional Romanian village out of existence. Thousands of old villages, with their farmhouses and gardens and churches and centuries of memory, were to be flattened and their people herded into bleak concrete apartment blocks in new agro-industrial centers. The idea was to break the peasant's tie to his own land, to make the rural population as controllable as the urban one, and to free up farmland. It was an assault not just on buildings but on a whole way of life, and it caused such international outrage that it was only partly carried out. But the bulldozers did their work in many places, and a great deal of old, irreplaceable Romania was simply ground into rubble. Imagine being told that the house your family had lived in for generations, the church where they were buried, the orchard your grandfather had planted, was to be flattened within weeks, and that you would be moved into a half-finished concrete block with thin walls and unreliable heat, your animals and your land taken from you, your whole inherited world erased to satisfy a diagram drawn in an office in the capital. That was the lived experience of village after village. It was not war that did this to them. It was an idea that the past itself was an obstacle to be cleared away to make room for the future the leader had decided they would have. And then there was Bucharest. In 1977, a powerful earthquake struck Romania, killing well over 1,000 people and badly damaging the capital. Ceausescu seized on the disaster as an opportunity. He would not merely repair Bucharest, he would remake its center in his own image, sweep away the old organic city of churches and narrow streets and 19th-century houses, and replace it with a vast, monumental civic center built to glorify the state and its leader. The demolitions began in the early 1980s, and they were brutal. An area of central Bucharest amounting to several square miles, a whole district of the old city, was condemned and torn down. Tens of thousands of people, by most accounts around 40,000, were given little notice and forced out of their homes, their houses demolished, their neighborhoods erased. Historic churches and monasteries, some of them centuries old, were knocked down. A few precious ones were saved by an extraordinary feat of engineering, physically lifted onto rails and moved, hidden away behind new apartment blocks where the leader would not have to see them. An entire layer of a great European capital, its history and its beauty, was scraped off to make room for one building. That building was the House of the People. Today it is called the Palace of the Parliament, and it is, by weight, the heaviest building in the world, more than 4 million tons of concrete, steel, marble, and crystal. It is the largest civilian administrative building on Earth. Its scale is genuinely difficult to comprehend in person. Room after enormous room, staircases built and rebuilt because the leader did not like how they felt under his feet, hundreds of thousands of square feet of floor, chandeliers the size of small rooms. Nearly all of it was carved out of the body of the country itself, marble quarried until the quarries ran short, immense quantities of timber and crystal and gold leaf, the very finest of everything Romania could produce, all of it poured into one building at the precise moment its citizens could not buy meat. Ceausescu came to the site again and again, an obsessive client, ordering finished walls torn down and built anew over the smallest displeasure, sending a completed grand staircase back to be rebuilt because the steps did not feel right beneath his feet as he climbed them. Crews labored through the nights under banks of floodlights, blazing away in a capital where the ordinary street lamps had been switched off to save power. You could stand in a black, freezing Bucharest street in the late 1980s, having queued 2 hours for nothing at an empty shop, and see, glowing up there on its hill, brilliant against the dark, the construction site of the most expensive building on the face of the earth. To build it, an army of workers, soldiers, and so-called volunteers labored in shifts around the clock, year after year. The official number who died in its construction is small, but the workers who were there have always insisted the true figure was far higher, and we will probably never know it for certain. Stand back and look at the whole picture for a moment, because it is the picture of the entire regime in one frame. A nation of people standing in the freezing dark, in lines for a quarter loaf of bread, and in the middle of their capital, lit up and rising, the most expensive, most extravagant building on the face of the earth, devouring the country's marble and labor and treasure, so that one man could have a palace worthy of the god he believed himself to be. He did not even live to see it finished. The revolution came first. The house of the people was still incomplete on the day its builder was shot, and there is a grim justice in that. He poured a fortune and a city's heart into a monument to his own permanence, and he never got to walk through the door. It would be wrong to imagine that the Romanian people simply endured all of this in perfect silence until the very end. They did not. There were cracks, long before 1989, moments when the fear broke and people stood up. And the way those moments were crushed tells you why it took so long, and why, when the dam finally broke, it broke so violently. The first big crack came early, in the summer of 1977, in a coal mining region called the Jew Valley. The government had passed a law stripping miners of certain pension rights and raising their retirement age, a hard blow to men who did some of the most dangerous and exhausting work in the country and who tended to die young because of it. Tens of thousands of miners went on strike. This was an enormous act of defiance in a state that did not permit strikes, that did not permit any independent action at all, and remarkably, Ceausescu himself went to the valley to face them. He was heckled, he was shouted down by furious men who had nothing left to lose, underground. For a moment the leader stood exposed in front of a crowd that did not love him, a small foreshadowing of the balcony to come. He made promises, concessions, soothing words, and then, once the strike was over and the danger had passed, the regime quietly broke every promise and went after the leaders of the strike, who were harassed, scattered, and in some cases are believed to have met early and suspicious deaths. The lesson the regime learned was that you could put down a rising with a smile and a lie and punish the brave ones later.
The second great crack came a decade after that, in November of 1987, in the city of Brazov. By then the austerity was grinding at its worst.
At a large factory, workers enraged by cut wages and impossible conditions walked out, and what began as a labor protest swelled into something more dangerous. Thousands of people poured into the streets, marched on the local Communist Party headquarters, broke in and threw portraits of Ceausescu and the trappings of the regime out of the windows. For a few hours, in a major Romanian city, ordinary people openly tore at the symbols of the leader. It was suppressed, of course. The security forces moved in, the ringleaders were arrested and beaten and dispersed, and the whole thing was buried from the news. But it had happened. People had seen, again, that the regime could be defied, that the portraits could be thrown out of windows and the sky did not fall. The fear was thinning. You could feel it if you knew how to feel for it. And by the end, the defiance was no longer rising only from the factory floor. It was coming from inside the regime's own household. In the spring of 1989, just months before the end, 6 men did something that should have been unthinkable. They were not young firebrands or foreign agents. They were veteran communists, old party men, several of them figures who had helped build the very system they were now turning against who had served near the top and then been shouldered aside. Together they composed an open letter to Ceausescu, a blunt, point-by-point indictment of his rule. They condemned the bulldozing of the villages. They condemned the suffocating surveillance, the ban on ordinary contact with the outside world, the squandering of the nation's wealth on his monstrous palace while the people went hungry. The letter was smuggled out of the country and beamed back into Romania over foreign radio so that ordinary citizens, crouched around forbidden sets, heard 6 of the leader's own former comrades say aloud the things they themselves could only think. The 6 were swiftly silenced, placed under house arrest, cut off, one of them interrogated dozens of times. There were lonelier voices too, a teacher in the city of Cluj among the bravest of them, who had refused for years to stay quiet and had paid for it in persecution and isolation. None of this toppled the regime by itself, but each act was a hairline crack running through something that had looked, for so very long, like solid stone. And all the while, the world around Romania was changing with astonishing speed. By 1989, the entire communist order of Eastern Europe was coming apart. In the Soviet Union, a reformer named Gorbachev was loosening Moscow's grip and talking openly about change. One by one, the satellite states began to slip their chains. Poland, Hungary. Then, in the autumn of 1989, the most stunning event of all, in November, the Berlin Wall, the very symbol of the divided continent, was opened, and crowds danced on top of it. Across the bloc, communist governments were falling, mostly without bloodshed, swept aside by their own people. And Ceausescu? Ceausescu was utterly unmoved. He despised Gorbachev and his reforms. He had no intention of loosening anything. When Gorbachev spoke of openness and restructuring, Ceausescu heard only weakness and the betrayal of the cause. He seems to have genuinely believed that he, alone among the leaders of the bloc, had got it right, and that all the others were surrendering to chaos. He had paid off the debt, he had built his palace, he had his applause. In his own mind he stood at the very height of his powers, a colossus, the one fixed point on a continent that had lost its nerve. And the reports reaching him from his own security services told him exactly what he wished to hear, because no one who valued their position dared tell him anything else. This is the trap that closes on every dictator who rules long enough. He had spent 20 years making it impossible for anyone to bring him bad news, and now, at the one moment when his life depended on hearing it, there was no one left who would say the words. He was the most powerful man in Romania and one of the most ignorant about the true state of his own country, and by the end those two things had become the same thing. As the dominoes fell around him, he convened a congress of his party in that same November, and there, in a hall full of officials, he was re-elected to his post by acclamation and treated to a standing ovation that the official record timed in many long minutes, the delegates clapping until their hands must have ached, a forest of arms raised in mechanical worship. He stood there, an old man at the very end of his era, the last hardline communist leader in Europe, surrounded by the falling of everything he represented, and he believed, genuinely believed, that he was immune, that his people loved him, that what was happening in Berlin and Prague and Warsaw could never happen in Bucharest. He had spent so long inside the hall of mirrors he had built that he had lost the ability to see out of it. He could not see that the country beyond the applauding delegates was cold and starving and finished with him. He thought he was a god. He was about to find out, on live television, that he was not. It started, as these things often do, in a place no one expected, over a matter that had nothing obviously to do with the fate of the nation. It started with a pastor. In the western Romanian city of Timisoara, near the Hungarian border, there was a Protestant minister named Laszlo Tokes, an ethnic Hungarian, a member of Romania's large Hungarian minority. Tokes had been increasingly outspoken, criticizing the regime, criticizing the systematization program that threatened the villages, speaking up in ways that had drawn the attention of the authorities. He had given an interview to foreign television, criticized the bulldozing of the villages from his own pulpit, and refused to be quietly cowed, which in that country, in those years, took a rare kind of courage. The state decided to be rid of him. In December of 1989, the order came down to evict him from his church apartment and remove him from the city. But something unexpected happened. His parishioners, and then others, decided they would not let him be taken quietly. On the 16th of December, people began to gather outside his building, forming a human chain, a peaceful vigil to protect their pastor. It was a small thing at first, a local matter, a few hundred people, but it did not break up. It grew, Hungarians and Romanians together. Ordinary citizens of Timisoara kept coming, and the small vigil for a pastor swelled, almost overnight, into something else entirely, a protest against the regime itself. The chants changed. People began to shout against Ceausescu, against the conditions of their lives, the things no one had dared shout in public for years. Years of swallowed rage came up all at once. Within a few days, the unrest had outgrown the church entirely. Crowds moved through the center of Timisoara into the squares, and the demonstration became a general revolt against the regime itself. Workers walked out of the great factories and joined the students. For a brief, astonishing stretch, the city slipped out of the government's hands altogether, the protesters effectively in control of their own streets. And the news of it, carried by word of mouth and by foreign radio, began to leak across the country despite everything the censors could do. The electrifying, impossible rumor that out west in Timisoara, the people had risen and the city had not been crushed. A spark had caught that the regime could not stamp out fast enough, and the wind was carrying it east toward the capital. The regime responded the only way it knew how. On the 17th of December and the days around it, the security forces and the army moved against the crowds in Timisoara with live ammunition. They fired on their own people in the streets. There was real bloodshed, real death, the first significant killing of the uprising. And it was here, in the chaos and terror of those days, that one of the strangest episodes of the whole revolution unfolded. One that I think it is important to tell honestly, because it shows how truth itself comes apart in moments like these. As word of the Timisoara killings spread, the numbers of the dead spread with it, and the numbers were enormous. Foreign news agencies, picking up reports from across the nearby borders, began to report that thousands had been massacred in Timisoara. The figure of 4,600 dead was quoted and repeated. Some reports ran far higher still, into the tens of thousands. There were horrifying accounts of mass graves, and pictures were broadcast around the world of bodies dug up from the earth, supposedly the victims of a great massacre, laid out for the cameras as proof of the regime's final atrocity. The images went everywhere. They helped convince the world, in those critical days, that Ceausescu was slaughtering his people by the thousand. And then, weeks later, the truth came out, and it was stranger and sadder than the legend. The death toll in Timisoara, though real and terrible, was not in the thousands. It was eventually established at around 90 people. The bodies that had been dug up and shown to the world as massacre victims were not, it turned out, the victims of any massacre at all. They were, for the most part, poor people who had died ordinary deaths and been buried in a pauper's section of the cemetery before the protests ever began, exhumed in the confusion and presented wrongly as evidence. It was not a deliberate hoax so much as a kind of mass hysteria of grief and rumor, in which a real horror got multiplied by fear and by the world's hunger for a story into a vastly larger phantom one. I tell you this not to diminish what happened in Timisoara, which was the brave and bloody beginning of the end, and where real people really did die standing up to a tyranny. I tell you because it matters, in a story about a man killed on television, to be honest about how images and numbers can run ahead of the truth in a crisis, and how the same revolution that was genuinely just could also be genuinely confused and full of things that were not quite true. Hold that thought. It is going to matter a great deal when we reach the trial. For now, what matters is this. Timisoara had risen and been fired upon and had not backed down. The blood was spilled, and the news of it, real and exaggerated all tangled together, was racing across the country toward the capital, toward a man who still could not believe any of it was really happening to him. Now we arrive at the moment the whole story has been bending toward, the moment that, more than any other, earns this video its title, because the breaking of Nicolae Ceausescu did not happen in secret. It happened in front of his entire nation, broadcast live, in the space of a few unbearable minutes, on the 21st of December, 1989. Ceausescu had been abroad when Timisoara erupted, on a state visit to Iran, and when he flew home and grasped the scale of what was happening, his response was pure instinct, the instinct of a man who had ruled by spectacle for decades. He would hold a rally, a great public meeting in the heart of Bucharest, in the square in front of the Central Committee building, where he could stand on the balcony and address a vast, adoring, organized crowd, denounce the troublemakers of Timisoara as foreign agents and hooligans, and demonstrate to the country and the world that the people of Romania stood solidly behind their leader. It had always worked before. The crowds were always bussed in, always supplied with banners and portraits, always coached to cheer on cue. It was the oldest trick in his book, and he reached for it without hesitation. So on the morning of the 21st of December, around 80,000 people were assembled in the square, many of them brought in from workplaces, holding the usual signs and pictures, arranged into the usual obedient mass, and the cameras of state television were there to broadcast the whole thing live to the nation, exactly as they had broadcast 1,000 such rallies before. Ceausescu came out onto the balcony, with Elena and the other leaders beside him, and began to speak in his familiar, flat, hectoring style about the achievements of socialism, about the events in Timisoara, about the enemies of the nation. The crowd applauded on cue, as it always did. For the first minute or two, it was just another rally, another broadcast, another day in the endless television hymn to the leader. And then something went wrong. To this day, people argue about exactly what triggered it. Some movement at the back of the crowd, some noise, perhaps a sound like firecrackers or a panic in one corner, a swaying of the mass. But whatever lit the fuse, the unthinkable happened. The crowd began to boo. From somewhere in that sea of organized faces came jeering, whistling, shouting, the sounds a Romanian crowd was never, ever supposed to make at the leader, and it spread. The noise rose and rolled across the square, and the careful, decades-old spell of the rally cracked open in real time. It came roughly 8 minutes into his speech. From the edges of the crowd, voices began to chant the name of the city where the blood had been spilled. Timisoara, Timisoara, the forbidden word, the name the regime had been frantically trying to keep out of every broadcast, was suddenly rolling across the official square in the very heart of the capital. Ceausescu, rattled, did something revealing in those first seconds. He tried to buy them. Stumbling, improvising, he began promising things: a rise in the minimum wage, an increase in the family allowances, small sums tossed out from the balcony like coins to a mob, as if the rage of a starved nation could be settled for a few extra lei a month. It was the reflex of a man who had never once in his life had to persuade anyone of anything, who knew only how to command and how to purchase, discovering in real time that he had nothing left that these people wanted. And it was all on live television. Millions of Romanians, sitting at home in front of their sets, saw it happen. They saw the crowd turn, but more than that, they saw his face. The cameras, for once, caught the truth, because no one had time to stop them. They caught the exact instant when Nicolae Ceausescu, the genius of the Carpathians, the man who had not heard a discouraging word in 20 years, realized that the crowd was against him. His expression froze, his eyebrows shot up, his mouth opened and worked, and for a moment no sound that mattered came out. He raised his hand, half in command, half in a kind of bewildered pleading, and he said, into the microphone, a few small words, asking for quiet, that have become famous in Romania, the sound of a god discovering he is only a frightened old man. He looked, in that instant, exactly like what he was, lost. The footage shows Elena beside him, leaning in, hissing at the crowd to be quiet, trying to steady him, and you can see the panic moving between them. The broadcast cut out. Someone in the television center, grasping the catastrophe, killed the live feed, and for a few minutes Romanian screens went to a holding image while the regime scrambled. But it was far too late. The thing had been seen. You cannot unbroadcast a moment like that. In living rooms across the entire country, the same realization was detonating in millions of heads at the same time. He is afraid. They booed him, and he did not strike them down. He is not a god. He is just a man on a balcony, and we are not alone in hating him. The whole square hates him. The whole country hates him, and he is afraid. The fear that had held the nation still for a generation broke, in an instant on live television, in the worst possible place for it to break, in front of everyone at once. The crowd in the square did not disperse in shame. It turned into the first crowd of the revolution, and the rally that was meant to save him became, instead, the exact moment he lost everything. That night and into the next morning, Bucharest descended into chaos. The crowds did not go home. They massed in the city center, growing, defiant, and the regime, panicking, sent its forces against them. There was shooting in the streets of the capital now, as there had been in Timisoara. People were killed, barricades went up, the army was deployed, and the great uncertain question of the next 48 hours began to take shape, the question on which everything would turn. Would the army fire on the people for Ceausescu, or would it turn? Through the night the violence flared and the outcome hung in the balance, while inside the Central Committee building an old man who had ruled for 24 years sat among advisors who could feel the floor tilting beneath them and tried to understand how, in a single morning, the ground had opened under his feet. Tanks and troops were on the boulevards. There were beatings, arrests, water cannon, and gunfire in the dark, and the dead of that first night in the capital began to mount. But the crowds, for the first time anyone could remember, did not melt away when the guns came out. Something had shifted in them on the balcony that morning, some final, silent recalculation about fear and what it was worth, and they kept flowing back into the streets, more of them by the hour. The regime was still firing, still arresting, still issuing furious orders down a chain of command that was beginning to ignore them. but it was now fighting the single thing it had never had to fight before. A people that had stopped being afraid all at once in front of one another, having watched the spell break on live television. The morning of the 22nd of December decided it, and what decided it was the army. Early that day came news that the Minister of Defense, the general in charge of Romania's armed forces, was dead. The official announcement called it suicide. The rumor, which spread instantly, was that he had killed himself rather than give the order to fire on the people, or that he had been killed for refusing. Whatever the truth of his death, its effect was electric and immediate. The army, leaderless and unwilling to massacre its own citizens for a doomed regime, began to change sides. Soldiers started to fraternize with the crowds. Tanks that had been sent to crush the protest turned around. The thing every dictator fears above all else was happening. His own guns were no longer his. By mid-morning, enormous crowds had broken through and were surging toward and into the Central Committee building itself, the very seat of his power, the building with the famous balcony. And inside it, Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu understood at last that they had to run. They made their way up through the building, up to the roof, where a helicopter was waiting. With a few aides and bodyguards, the couple climbed aboard, and the helicopter lifted off from the rooftop just as the crowds poured into the building below. People who were there described looking up and seeing it rise, this small machine carrying away the man who had seemed, a week earlier, as permanent as the mountains. The most powerful person in Romania was fleeing across the rooftops of his own burning capital. But there was nowhere to flee to. This is the part that has the quality of a bleak fable. The helicopter flew, but the country it flew over was no longer his. The pilot, frightened, aware that the regime was collapsing beneath them and that the skies might no longer be safe, soon set down. The couple were transferred to a car, and what followed was a grim, almost absurd few hours of wandering. They commandeered vehicles. They were driven from place to place by men who, hour by hour, were realizing that the people in the back seat were no longer rulers but fugitives, and dangerous ones to be caught with. They were taken from one location to another, increasingly desperate, increasingly without a plan, too. Elderly people in heavy coats being shuttled around the countryside as the news on every radio announced that their government had fallen. There is something almost unbearable in the smallness of those hours. The man who had raised the heaviest building on earth, who had gripped a royal scepter, who had been toasted by presidents and a queen, was reduced to the passenger seat of a borrowed car, snapping at his wife, ordering terrified strangers to drive faster, with no destination, no plan, and no power left to enforce a single word he said. They were taken in for a few minutes here, turned out there, as one frightened set of hands after another grasped that to be caught sheltering the falling dictator was to share in whatever was coming to him. The country was peeling away from them in real time, household by household, mile by mile, until there was nowhere left in all of Romania that would have them. Finally, they were brought to a town not far from the capital, and there, at an agricultural building, they were effectively cornered. Local authorities and then soldiers took them into custody. They were held, for a time, almost informally, two prisoners whom no one quite knew what to do with, shuttled into the keeping of an army garrison in the town of Targovist. The fearsome condicator and his academician wife, who days before had commanded a nation of 23 million, sat under guard in a bare military room, arguing with their captors, insisting they were still the lawful leaders of Romania, demanding to be treated with respect, while outside the whole edifice of their power dissolved. Meanwhile, in Bucharest, a new authority was hastily forming itself out of the chaos, a group of officials, army officers, and former communists who had broken with Ceausescu, calling themselves the National Salvation Front. They announced on television, on that same all-important television, that the dictator had fled and that they had taken power. And almost at once, the revolution entered its most confused and bloody phase, because even with Ceausescu gone, the shooting did not stop. It got worse. Across Bucharest and other cities, gun battles erupted, and a terror took hold. The fear of mysterious snipers, of regime loyalists, of shadowy forces the new authorities called the terrorists, supposedly fanatical Securitate troops fighting on for their fallen leader. To this day, historians argue about who exactly was shooting whom in those days, how much was real resistance and how much was panic, confusion, soldiers firing at one another in the dark. But the dying was real. Of the more than 1,100 people who lost their lives in the Romanian Revolution, the great majority died here, in the chaos after Ceausescu had already fallen, after the cause was already won. They died in the fog, in the confusion of a state coming apart. It is one of the bitter truths of this revolution, and one the later celebrations never quite knew what to do with. More Romanians were killed in the days right after Ceausescu fell than in all the days of rising up against him. The tyrant was already caged, his power already broken, and still the shooting went on, in a country so primed for terror, so saturated with the expectation of hidden enemies, that it began, in places, to fight its own shadow. And it was against that backdrop, with the capital still crackling with gunfire and the new authorities terrified that loyalist forces might somehow rescue the captured couple and turn the tide, that the decision was made about what to do with the 2 prisoners in Targovist. The decision was that they had to die and that it had to happen fast. On Christmas Day, the 25th of December, 1989, the new leaders of Romania put Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu on trial. If you can call it a trial, it is one of the most extraordinary and most troubling pieces of footage of the entire 20th century, and because it was filmed, you can watch it to this day. The decision came from the top of the new authority. There was a faction that simply wanted the couple shot at once, immediately, no ceremony. There was another that insisted on at least the form of a trial first, a legal proceeding, however hurried, to put some shape of justice around the killing. The compromise was a military tribunal, assembled in haste in a bare room at the army garrison where the couple were being held. A panel of judges and a prosecutor were brought in. A pair of defense lawyers were appointed, men who had been given almost no time, and who in the footage seem at moments to be arguing for the prosecution as much as for their clients. The whole thing was arranged in a matter of hours, and a camera was set up to record it. The trial lasted less than an hour. Watching it, what strikes you is the unreality of it, the sense of a world turned upside down. For decades these two had sat in absolute judgment over others. Now they sat on hard chairs in a shabby room, an old man and an old woman being shouted at by their accusers. The charges were read out. Genocide. The killing, the prosecution claimed, of 60,000 people. The undermining of the national economy. The destruction of public institutions. The accusation that they had stashed vast sums, $1 billion, in foreign bank accounts. Some of these charges were grounded in the real and terrible record of the regime. Others, like the precise figure of 60,000 dead, were inflated and confused, born of the same fog of rumor that had produced the phantom mass graves of Timisoara, numbers seized in a hurry to justify a killing that the new rulers had, in truth, already decided upon. And the Ceausescus, to the end, did not break. This is the detail that everyone who watches the footage remembers. They were not pathetic, they were not pleading, they were defiant, contemptuous, certain to the last of their own legitimacy. Nicolae refused to recognize the court at all. He insisted he would answer only to the Grand National Assembly, the parliament he himself had controlled. He called the proceeding a coup, an illegal act by usurpers. He refused to acknowledge that the men in front of him had any right to judge him. Elena was sharper still, snapping at the judges, dismissing the charges with disdain. When their own lawyer suggested they might plead insanity as a way to escape the firing squad, Elena reportedly rejected the idea with fury, calling the whole thing an outrage and a setup. Whatever else they were not cowards in that room. They had ruled together, and they would not grovel together. They held each other's reality to the end, the two of them against the world, exactly as they had been since the prison years, and the laboratory, and the long climb to the top. Watching the footage now, it is the small human details that stay with you. The bare, cold room. The two of them in their heavy overcoats, seated at a plain table. Nicolae glancing down at his wristwatch at one point as though he had somewhere more important to be. Elena interrupting, indignant, correcting her accusers, insisting on her dignity as a mother and a scientist. Nicolae refusing again and again to answer the questions, repeating that this court had no authority over him, that he recognized only the Grand National Assembly, the rubber-stamp parliament he himself had ruled for a quarter of a century. They argued, they scoffed, they behaved, to the very last, as though the world were still arranged around them, and these men were committing an outrage that history would one day punish. They could not, or would not, grasp that the arrangement was already over, that the shabby room they sat in was the last room, and that there would be no appeal to any assembly, because the assembly, like the country, had already walked away from them. The verdict was, of course, never in doubt. The tribunal found them guilty of all charges and sentenced them both to death. In a final, hollow gesture toward legality, the sentence formally allowed for an appeal to a higher court. But that provision was meaningless, a fiction, because the people running the trial had no intention of waiting. The couple were to be executed at once, within minutes, before any appeal could be imagined, before any rescue could be attempted, before anyone could have second thoughts. Their hands were tied behind their backs with rope. Elena protested at this, at the indignity of being bound, and there was an ugly struggle over it. And then they were taken outside, into a small courtyard at the garrison, to a wall. A firing squad had been assembled from a regiment of paratroopers, young soldiers, and so many of them had volunteered for the duty that the officers had to choose among them. A handful were selected. They took up their positions, and the two old people who had ruled Romania for a generation were stood against the wall, in the cold. What happened next happened very fast. The soldiers were so eager and the moment so charged that some of them apparently began firing almost before the order was fully given. Nicolae, in his last seconds, is said to have started to sing a bar or two of the communist anthem he had lived his whole life by, and to have called out that they could have shot him without this masquerade of a trial. And then the rifles opened up, on automatic, and they fired and fired. When it was over, more than 100 rounds were found in the two bodies. It was, by the clock, around 10 minutes before 3 in the afternoon on Christmas Day. Nicolae Ceausescu was 71 years old. Elena was a few years older. They had been married for more than 40 years, and they died within the same minute, a few feet apart, against the same wall. Afterward, the two bodies were covered and flown away, and in the strange, frightened days that followed, they were buried quietly, under false names at first, in a cemetery in Bucharest, as though even in death the new authorities were not quite certain what to do with them or how much danger they might still pose. The most photographed couple in the country went into the ground almost in secret. It would be years before the graves were openly marked, and longer still before the arguments about that Christmas day began, even slightly, to cool. And here is the final, fitting irony, the thing that brings us all the way back to where we began. The camera that had been brought to record it all was not quite ready for the speed of the killing. The execution came so fast and so frantically that the crew did not capture the firing itself in full. They got the aftermath. They got the two bodies on the ground. They got the long, terrible, unflinching footage of the dead faces. And that footage, the trial and the corpses, was exactly what the new Romania chose to broadcast. Think about what that meant for the people watching at home. For 24 years, the television set in the corner of every Romanian living room had shown them one thing above all others: him, his face, his speeches, his factory visits, the endless applause, the 2-hour nightly hymn to the genius of the Carpathians. The screen had been his more completely than almost any dictator's screen in history. It was the chief instrument of his godhood, the mirror in which the whole nation was forced to admire him. And now, on that same screen, in the days after Christmas, the nation watched the end of him. They had already watched, live, the moment his face crumpled on the balcony, the instant the spell broke in front of everyone at once. And now they watched the rest, the hurried trial in the bare room, the defiant old couple, and then the bodies. The footage went out in Romania, and within 2 days it had gone out across the world, played and replayed on every network on Earth. The man who had controlled every image of himself with absolute, obsessive care, who had never once allowed himself to be filmed from a bad angle, ended as the most exposed corpse on the planet. His dead face beamed into hundreds of millions of homes. The screen he had owned took its revenge. That, in the end, is what the title of this story means. Romania killed its dictator and his wife, yes, but the deeper truth is that it did so on television, through television, and that the television was the very throne he had built for himself. He died on the instrument of his own worship. I will not pretend the ending was clean, because it was not, and you deserve the honest version. The trial was a travesty by any normal standard of justice, a thing rushed through in under an hour to reach a verdict already decided. People have argued ever since about whether it had to happen that way, whether the haste was a panicked necessity in a country still convulsed by gunfire, or whether it was something uglier, a way for certain men in the new government, some of them former communists themselves, to make very sure that the only two people who could implicate them were silenced before they could speak. The prosecutor who pressed the case at that trial would be dead within a few months, by his own hand, the official record says. The deaths in the revolution, more than 1,100 of them, were mostly not the work of Ceausescu's guns at all, but of the chaos that followed his fall, and the full truth of who was shooting in those days has never been entirely settled. Even the 60,000 he was charged with killing turned out to be a number born of fear and rumor, like the phantom graves of Timisoara. The man had genuine monstrous crimes to answer for: the cold, the hunger, the secret police, the stolen childhoods, the decades of fear. He did not need invented ones, but in the rush of those final days, the real and the invented got tangled together, and they have stayed tangled ever since. What is not in doubt is the suffering he caused and the strange completeness of his fall. Romania inherited a great deal from him and is still living with it. The empty, beautiful, monstrous palace still stands in the center of Bucharest, far too vast to tear down, now home to the parliament of a free country, a building no one quite knows what to feel about. It is a tourist attraction now, and a seat of democratic government, and an open wound, all at once. Romanians walk through its absurd marble halls and feel a tangle of shame and awe and grief that has never quite found a name. The generation of children born of his decree, and the institutions that warehoused so many of them, left wounds that took many years to even begin to heal. The files of the secret police, the records of who informed on whom, were opened, and a nation had to reckon with how many of its neighbors and friends had been watching it all along. And every Romanian old enough to remember carries, somewhere, the image of that face on the balcony, the exact instant a god became a frightened man, the moment they all understood, together, on live television, that the spell was broken. That is where I will leave it, on the image of the screen. I am curious about one specific thing tonight, and if it touches you, I would be glad to hear it below. If you were alive in the winter of 1989, anywhere in the world, you may well have watched some of this unfold on your own television, the booing on the balcony, the news of the trial, perhaps the footage of the bodies that ran on every channel that strange week between Christmas and the New Year. If you remember that, let me know what it felt like to watch it, and where in the world you were sitting when you did. And if you were not yet born, or came to all this only tonight, tell me that instead. There is something worth marking in the fact that a moment built to be forgotten by its own makers is still being watched and talked about and understood all these years and all these miles later. I'm Arthur, and this has been the story of how a nation, pushed past the last of its patience, reached up and pulled down the god it had been forced to worship, and did it in full view, on the very screens he thought were his forever. There are other rulers and other reckonings that the tidy histories would rather hurry past. On another evening, when you are ready for the dark again, we will find one of them and sit with it just like this. Until then, you can switch off the screen whenever you like. That, after all, was the one freedom he could never allow. Tonight, it is yours.